Yeah, let's do this thing. Everybody, my name is Christy Wiley, and I am with the Cook Center for Human Connection, and I'm one of the facilitators for the parentguidance.org series, mental health series. And we'd like for you, if you've been with us in the past, we use a really great technology called Menti. So we'd like you to go to menti.com and type in code 7316 or 8102. Well, it's the whole thing. 7316 8102. And it looks like we have some people in there. So just waiting for everybody to get in there. You can use the camera app on your phone and you can push that QR code. It'll take you right to where we need to be. But as we get started today, I just want to let you know, that we are going to be talking about a heavy topic today, which is grief. And I know that what has made you join is probably because you are going through something, you're experiencing and going through grief, or you know somebody that you're trying to help through the phases of grief. So we're so glad that you're here. And I want you to know that we're holding space for you, but be kind and gentle with yourself as we go through this tonight. And just so you know, everything that you say through Menti, it's all anonymous. So we don't know who's typing. There's no videos on, there's no sound. So it's a way for us to all share in a safe space. So I'll hope that you'll do that. Thank you to Dr. Edwards and Dr. Griven for bringing parentguidance.org to your school and planning for these discussions to help you help your child. And thank you again, Tina, for being with us and introducing me and us getting through that little technical issue. I'm so glad we were able to figure out how to make it work. So how I want to start is I'd like to know, what are the ages of your kiddos? So do you have elementary, middle, high school? Maybe you have multiple ages in your home. You can select all of those that apply and then hit submit. I will tell you that I am a single mom to a 6th grader. So we are navigating middle school for the first time this year. So I have a beautiful young daughter. She's in the orchestra. She's amazing. But I will say there's no manual when it comes to being a parent, and parentguidance.org, I use it all the time. It's the closest thing I have found. So I'm so glad these resources are here, but it looks like mostly elementary joining us tonight, and also then a split between middle and high. So welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be hearing from two therapists, Dr. Abrams and Dr. Wired. Dr. Abrams is a licensed clinical psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia, and the founder and executive director of Ascension Behavioral Health. And then Dr. Wired is a licensed clinical therapist and a certified grief counselor and a co-author of The Journey to Potential Through Grief and Loss. And today our two experts are going to be talking to us about loss and how grief is the process we go through that redefines us after we experience some type of loss. So today's session, we are going to cover the definition of what is grief, as well as the 5 phases of grief. And then we're going to talk about the feelings we can expect as we go through these phases. And then we're going to wrap it all up. And just as we get started, and I know that you've probably heard this, but I just want to say it, grief is not linear. And our two therapists are going to talk about that. But, you could be in this stage one day and this stage the next, and then go back to that stage and be all over the place. And that's okay. Okay. So just want to let you know it's not linear and you need to take care of you. Okay. All right. So here we go. Tina, as far as internet bandwidth, I think if you'll turn your camera off, we might have a little bit better bandwidth, and then we'll bring you back on in the end. Is that okay?
That is okay.
Yay. Not that I don't want to see your lovely beach.
No, no worries.
All right, everybody. So I am curious to know, what we know is that the the majority of Americans, are dealing with grief and loss right now. More than 57% of Americans reported experiencing a major loss over the last 3 years. The last 3 years has been tough, right? And there's that old adage, well, you don't know what someone has been through until you walk in their shoes. And that is so true. So what brought you here to the webinar tonight? And again, this is completely anonymous. We don't know who you are, but is there something that's on your mind? A recent loss or someone that you're trying to support? But what are some of the challenges that may be heavy right now for you? So we'll give just a few seconds to answer in Menti. I know for me, it feels heavy for me navigating, Layla as she's now in middle school and that extra responsibility. So it just feels the discipline, and then also limiting social media time is also super heavy all the time. Forgiving, yes, and a family, a loss of support. Okay. All right. A recent loss and trying to stay strong, but also nurture my family during this tough time. Absolutely. So those of you who have recently experienced a loss, I'm so sorry for your loss. And, this is a great place to start when we're trying to heal, to learn about the thing, to learn about grief and learn, the different phases of that. So thank you for sharing that, everyone. So what exactly is grief? Is it the sadness that we experience from losing someone or even something that we love? Dr. Wired is going to share with us what grief is, when we experience grief, and what it allows us to do. So here is Dr. Wired now.
So the phases of grief come from a loss. So there is a difference. We have a loss which redefines us. We've died in many forms and ways of how we used to be defined. Then we have grief. Grief is the process that lets us redefine ourselves into the present. We might not want to, because we might like our old past, but we can't change it. So instead of being caught in the past, overwhelmed by the future, and having those two collide, the process of grief, the phases through a grief process, allow us to redefine and not be confined and defined by our past, but glean the wisdom from our past to help us in the present.
So everyone will experience grief at some time in their lives. And unfortunately, we never know when we're going to process the experience or go through something until it happens. As Dr. Wired explained, grief is the process that helps us to redefine ourselves in the present. And it's important that we're not confined to the past in order for us to move forward and feel healthy. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but in Menti, you can place a dot, a quick temperature check. As you view the picture, think about what fits you best. So using your phones in Menti, place a dot in the area that best describes you and why you're joining today's session. So are you grieving a loss? So maybe it's a death, maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's a loss of connection. One of you said loss of support, or you're supporting someone who's grieving, or you're here to learn for future needs. We all know that we'll go through this at some point. And it looks like here for future needs, and then also grieving as well. Okay. So thank you again for being here. When you think of grief, it's typically tied to a reaction to death, though it can occur anytime we experience something we weren't expecting or hoped for. Dr. Abrams is going to explain more about losses and the different types of losses that can cause us to grieve.
Grief is a universal experience that all of us have either already experienced in our lives or will at some point experience. Most of the times we tend to think about grief as related to death or dying and the loss of someone in a physical sense. Grief also is related to a sense of loss and transition, and that can come across any area of our lives. Grief can show up in different kind of transitions like changing a job or job loss, or moving to a new city and now you miss someone or you kind of miss what your life looked like. Grief can be just things changing in your life as people in your life kind of move through different transitions. We can grieve friendships that no longer feel the same because our life circumstances are different. We can grieve how we experience kind of different parts of our career, right? Because now we've moved into different positions or kind of mobility in our careers that now don't feel as connected as they used to. All of these are different forms of grief. And it can be helpful to think about grief as a natural process that we go through as we grow and as we change throughout life. And these are things that we can still develop some coping strategies around.
So grief is more than just the sadness of losing a loved one, right? It's it can be death in the way we know it, or a death of something. Grief is related to a sense of loss, or maybe it's a transition. It can be hard when we have to face change in any areas of our life. And I'll tell you, for me right now, as I think about more about grief and loss in my life currently, I'm starting to grieve the loss of the relationship I had with my parents, because as my parents get older, they are changing and there's some dementia issues. And so I'm grieving the relationship that I used to have with my parents now that I'm transitioning into a place where I'm helping take care of them. So grief is a normal response to loss, and disaster, traumatic events, a loss of life, or drastic life changes can cause common grief reactions. And some common grief reactions are shock, disbelief, denial, anxiety, distress. Anger is a typical reaction because we're misplacing our grief as anger. Periods of sadness, or maybe even a loss of sleep, or even a loss of appetite. Or you could be the person on the other side that starts to sleep too much, or starts to emotionally eat to feel that grief, right? To feel. So as Dr. Abrams was talking, what were types of grief you could relate to? So other types of grief can be estrangement. I know that I did, I got sideways with a friend in college once. She was my best friend, and I really did grieve the loss of that close friendship. It could be, a shift in the relationship. Maybe you're feeling your teenager pull away from you, as they're starting to mature and go out on their own, or maybe it's a family member who has distanced themselves from you. So using that sliding scale on Menti, which I see that many of you have done, how have you been affected? So financial or worldly loss, those major disasters that cause people to grieve as they face losses. So I know the hurricane has recently displaced people in your area. Letting go of someone or something, so that's very affected. And that's seasonal grief. Some people might even grieve the loss of summer during the winter months because it's dark and gray. Not necessarily sometimes in Florida. But yeah, so look like that estrangement and letting go of something or someone is mostly where we're at. And thank you for sharing that. So when we think of grief, the loss of life, again, often comes to mind, but that's only one example, as we've already discussed. 72% of people report that the first 12 months after a loss, any kind of loss, is the hardest. Okay. And the first year without your loved one, can be difficult, especially as the different milestones approach. Maybe it's an anniversary, or it is a holiday, Valentine's Day, first birthday. Each of these days are going to be difficult in their own ways, but grief does not end on month 13. We know this. So give yourself permission to grieve. Give yourself permission to take as much time as you need. Even years after the loss occurred, we can still grieve, again, because these phases are not linear. People all process differently based on their age, based on their surroundings, based on events, based on the type of support that they have. So this is a deeply personal journey with no timeline or end date, okay? So as we move through the grieving process, we're fragile, especially as we experience a new range of emotions that we're not familiar with. It could be the first time we've lost a parent, or we've lost a child, or lost someone so close to us, or a job that really meant a lot to us. Grief comes in phases. And in the next few segments, Dr. Wired is going to explain to us the 5 phases of grief.
So let's talk about these things called the phases of grief. The first one I always mention is actually acceptance. And most people go, whoa, what do you mean acceptance? Please remember, acceptance means the acknowledgement of a fact. It does not mean everything's okay and everything's wonderful. No, that's not the process or the purpose of grief. Grief helps us redefine, not have everything be okay. That's why it's a lifetime process. So actually, of course, acceptance doesn't happen completely at the beginning. So we'll go through these phases, and the reason they're called phases is it's not a linear process. I don't have the magic to speak holographically, so I have to speak linearly. But if you can imagine this being a porous process in which we move in and out of different phases at different times. So as I speak today about the phases of grief, please remember, I have to, vocabulary-wise, speak in a linear form. If you can think about these at different times with different frequencies, intensities, and durations, we will be in some of these phases in our life. Sometimes we'll know exactly where we are. Sometimes it'll be a mush of all of them. And other times it might be a mixture.
Grief, again, is not a 5-step process where you can check the box once you've gone through all the steps. I've gone through each of these emotions, so I'm done. Okay, that's not how it works. The grieving process is referred to the 5 phases, which means your emotions can be like this street sign. I'm here, and then I'm here, and then I'm here. Okay, it can be a web of emotions, and we refer to them as phases, not steps, because we go in and out of them in no particular order. So there's no right or wrong way to go through the phases of grief. But Dr. Wired started with talking about acceptance. Ooh, that's hard, okay? Generally, if we're not in the phase of acceptance, then we're in some way fighting against it or avoiding reality. That's hard to hear. But this can affect us in many ways. For example, a breakup or a divorce. A sign of acceptance may be when you finally decide this is ultimately a healthy choice. This is the healthier choice for me, right? Or perhaps you have experienced the loss of a loved one and you can appreciate the time spent with them. We'll always feel like there wasn't enough time, but can we have gratitude for the time we had? That's acceptance. Or you go through a change, you move homes, you're leaving friends, you're leaving the familiar. Acceptance would be realizing that you can create new memories in your new environment. So maybe you're moving away from home with a husband or a spouse, and you need to create new adventures and new memories in your new place. Dr. Wired said, acceptance is the phase where we start to realign. Acceptance is the place where we start to realign. But as he mentioned, there's no particular order, and everyone can experience these phases differently. So it's important not to compare the way one person handles a situation versus you. And that can be hard if you're both experiencing the same loss, you and someone else in your family, y'all are going to be at different phases at different times. And that can be hard to see that someone else is in acceptance and you're angry, or vice versa. Okay, so again, give not only yourself some grace, give each other some grace as well as you support others. So let's listen more to Dr. Wired now.
So denial is the first phase most of us move into. Denial, I call insulation. It's the pace where we retract from that loss. We move away from that loss. We're trying to buy time. So I call it insulation because the stimuli is too much. It's more than I can take. And as I say that, please remember that this is a fluid process. We can have that acceptance that there is this loss. But denial buys us time for my emotional and cognitive world to realign, where they may be way two dichotomies that are so huge. And so denial is that insulation, that ebb and flow, back and forth, getting closer and closer where I've retracted away. Also keep in mind, as I retract away, I'm going to try to find distractors, from anger to rage to different pieces, as well as addictive tendencies, from alcohol, tobacco, drugs, porn, electronics, anything, because my system is saying, I can't do this, I can't look at this. So it tries to find other places. So in that ebb and flow, if we can be conscious of finding healthy recess, finding things that don't hurt me, others, or the earth, that give us a break, because we can get grief fatigue. But denial is that ebb and flow. And over time, I can realign so that my cognitive process as well as my emotional world are realigned in that present moment. In the midst of that ebb and flow, somewhere in there we move into anger. So anger is that protest. This is not what I wanted. I wanted a different kind of film. I'm the producer of my movie. And all of a sudden I realize I don't have that choice. So I protest. In that protest, I slowly move into bargaining. And I call bargaining the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, or that cognitive connection, trying to connect those dots to make sense where they haven't been. And so I pretend that in my brain, it's almost as if I'm the producer of a movie, and I don't like this loss, so I say, cut, let's put this in there. Ouch, but I still hit that loss. What about this? Ouch, what about this? So I'm chiseling on denial. I'm chiseling on that denial, realizing that I can't change that loss. The shoulda, coulda, wouldas don't even have to make sense. This is a really important phase because I'm in that turmoil and I'm moving it back and forth. I can slowly glean wisdom from that, but not at the beginning. It's just me trying to find a way that I still have control and can change the outcome called my loss.
Okay. So if you've experienced any of these feelings of grief, so fatigue, denial, anger, or even that bargaining, if I would have done this, this would have happened. We've got to let go of any coulda, woulda, shoulda, because that will leave us in shame and guilt, right? And those feelings are so normal, though. They're so normal. You're going to go through them. But let's take a minute to break down these feelings a bit more and how they may look and feel. So denial, Dr. Wire talked about, it's an act of insulation. So like buffering us, like putting the saran wrap around us or the bubble wrap. It buys us time for our world to realign. You may be feeling shock, but they may be mistakenly seeing your shock as avoidance. Which one is it? Or maybe you feel numb and you just can't process what needs to be taking place, but others think you are procrastinating, okay? There's no time limit, again, on any of these phases. For some, each phase can last days, months, or even years. And again, we're going to go in and out of them all the time, okay? But let's hear from Dr. Abrams now about the avoidance in grief.
Some of the most immediate strategies that we use to cope with grief are avoidance. Avoiding anything that feels like it will remind you of how painful this loss feels for you. And when I say avoidance, that means trying not to think about this person or this experience that you've had that has created loss for you, trying to have no reminders around you, trying to avoid people who might remind you of things. There are all these ways, right, in which we might feel triggered, and we find ourselves trying to avoid these different triggers. Avoidance can look like avoiding things outside of the home. So avoiding areas of town, avoiding certain streets, avoiding certain buildings, anything that feels like it is associated with what this person's life or kind of work might have been. When we think about loss or transitions in other areas of our lives, again, we might associate it with, it might not be something that I did maybe with someone, but something that reminds me of a very hard time in my life. Something that can help us navigate avoidance is actually confronting the idea, the feeling, the thought process that we're trying to not feel at all. Confronting it, although it doesn't sound like it, allows us to really strip it of its power. When we name it, when we acknowledge our sadness and our grief, when we don't pathologize or penalize ourselves for having these very human emotions, right? When we don't put a timetable on our grief by saying, I shouldn't feel sad anymore, I shouldn't feel angry, I should be over it by now. When we actually give our grief room, right, to breathe and room to be whatever it is and room to kind of come in whichever ways it will come in, that allows us to create a different relationship with our grief. And it doesn't mean that grief gets easier. It doesn't mean that grief might go away, but we get stronger at coping with it. We find a different way to kind of place it in our bodies, right? So it doesn't feel like as though it kind of hijacks us as much as it maybe once did. But being able to avoid avoiding the grief actually allows us to create space, right, for the love that we had, for the experience that we had, and for the human experience of moving through really difficult transitions. So we want to look at ways to actually confront and cope with the grief by using our social support system, and sometimes by even seeking the help of a medical professional who can help us understand how our grief is showing up and to help us normalize it and to help us not judge ourselves for having really big feelings about really serious things for us.
So let's take a closer look at some things someone may avoid. If someone experiences grief, it is normal for them to avoid because you're uncomfortable with the physical, behavioral, or emotional reactions that they're experiencing. So developing coping skills is important, and developing healthy coping skills. Some people may already have had past experiences that help them fine tune their coping skills, or you may be going through something like this for the first time. Some people may even avoid going to sleep because they're afraid of the nightmares, or someone may avoid putting away someone's belongings for fear that they will lose that connection. Or some may even avoid a certain street where an accident might have occurred. Again, this is all normal behavior, and you will go through that. But grief is always unpleasant and uncomfortable. We know this. But some may so you are trying to avoid these situations or control them, okay? But when we are trying to confront the pain, it allows us to strip it of its power. So when we're ready, we can do those things, and then that strips that power that avoidance has. There's a time when we need to avoid avoiding. And part of the healing process is gradually facing those things you naturally want to avoid. Okay. And if you're supporting someone who's grieving, it's important that you're there for them. And some make the mistake of being too forceful, like it's time for you to go clean out that room, or it's time for you to get out of the house, or whatever it is. Okay. And then they talk too much, and then you start avoiding that person, but grief is not contagious. It may be hard to know what to say. But oftentimes, if we can even say, I don't know what to say, the honesty and transparency when we're trying to support someone can say, I can't even imagine what you're going through right now, but I'm going to sit next to you and I care about you and you let me know what you need. So I've sometimes seen those pictures or memes that's like, do you want a hug? No. Do you want some soup? No. Do you know what you want? No. And then the person just says, well, I'm just going to sit here next to you then. And sometimes someone just needs you to be there and not do anything, but just be there. Okay. So, we need to provide that shoulder to cry on, or that listening ear when we're trying to support someone, but it could be just sitting there in silence and being with someone. So just showing up is exactly what that person may need. But this is what shows up often. This is part of one of those phases, and it is anger. anger. It's the protest going on inside yourself because you wanted a different outcome, or this isn't fair, or no parent should have to grieve the loss of their child. You get angry. Okay. But let's look at this chart and see if you can relate to any of these feelings. If you're feeling frustration, it may look like pessimism to others, or maybe you feel rage inside, but to others, it looks like you're being aggressive. For those you are supporting, be curious about what is driving the feeling beneath the behavior. Okay. So oftentimes I think it's important to say, I am angry right now, but if you notice, why am I angry? What's going on? Am I really angry at this person or this situation? Or am I letting my anger, explode out on this person in front of me because of something else? Okay. And that's hard to get a grip on. And again, one of those phases. This next phase, bargaining. And this is that woulda, coulda, shoulda that Dr. Wired talks about. You're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to control the outcome of your loss. If you're feeling fear, anxiety, insecurity, others may think you're assuming the worst. But, can you feel guilty when you're thinking about the past? Do you find yourself saying, I should have, or I wish I would have? Okay. If you're supporting someone going through the grieving process or going through the process yourself, it's important to stop and think about all the new emotions that they or you are experiencing and honor them. And again, part of that avoidance is we're trying to avoid that feeling. So this is that whole idea where I'm going to push it down. I'm going to push it down. I'm going to be on my phone. I'm going to cook. I'm going to get really busy at work. Some of the other behaviors that Dr. Wired talked about. We use that to distract so we don't have to feel the emotion, but when we're ready, allow yourself to feel the emotion. That way, only by feeling it can you move through it. There's no way over. There's no way under. We really have to move through it. And that's where the healing can happen. But what about kids? When grief strikes a family, a school, a community, it's important to keep in mind your own grief and your child's grief. Okay, so your own emotions versus your child's emotions. Children grieve too. And just like adults, they all grieve differently. And sometimes as adults, we have to be in the right space to be at the right place to help our children who are grieving. So we have to go through and handle our own emotions before we, spit up all over our children what our emotions are, whilst we're trying to help them through their grief. So when grief strikes a family, a school, or community, it is important to keep in mind own grief versus your grief. So in Menti, if you're with us there in Menti, and you can join us at 7316-8102. If you know a child that's dealing with grief, what factors do you believe are affecting that child? And you can select on there through Menti what you think, which factors might affect children. So is it age, personality, the amount of support they had, the developmental age, how others are grieving? Okay. Some children may want to talk, other kids may not. As they grow and develop, new emotions will surface as they learn to process their grief at different developmental stages. Okay. And you may find if your child has experienced a situation young in life, as they reach new stages in development, they may reprocess the grief differently. Again, you never are like, okay, my grieving is done. And it's the same for children, especially as they grow developmentally. And so it's really important to use videos or children's stories and pictures to help guide conversations about the feelings they're experiencing. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. How others are grieving, you think are factors that affect? I think so too. I do think age, which means that developmental stage, I think is important. So what if children can be hard? You know, is it hard to know if a child is grieving? How do we know? You know, kids are really so resilient. But so it's important to recognize the signs of grieving. So here are some signs to look for in your child. So maybe they are having difficulty concentrating. There may be sleeping problems, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, clinginess, especially for young children, anxiety, feeling abandoned, developmental regression or losing milestones that they've already achieved, changes in their behavior or play, and then feelings of guilt that you're seeing in your child. So let's hear now from Dr. Wired about how this can affect those who are grieving.
As we chisel on that denial and move back and forth and have the shoulda, coulda, wouldas of the cognitive process of trying to make sense out of it, we get exhausted. We move into the phase of depression, which I call sad and surrender. Now, this is situational depression, which can be very different than the clinical depression. It can lead to those places, but we have this thing called situational depression. In other words, I'm so exhausted from bargaining and denial and ways of trying to run around my loss, even though it's right in my face, as each one of you know just as well. We drop. And I'm sad. I'm scared. I surrender to this process called I have a loss. And so I can't fight anymore. I realize I don't have control and I can't change that loss. This is a very important piece. Depression just means I've dropped. And this dropping is so, so important because it drops into my heart in the fight, flight, freeze process. This is the freeze. This is where grief lives. So within those pieces, we acknowledge we have this loss. As we acknowledge that, we get to start to move to new levels of healing. We flow into higher levels of acceptance, the acknowledgement of the fact. I have these emotions and these feelings and this anguish due to having a loss. And in that, we have the opportunity to heal more and more. But from there, we start to see this roadmap that we don't do linearly, and it's not on a certain timeline, but we move in and out of an ebb forward and flow back in both directions. And we slowly meander into refinding ourselves once again in that present moment, gleaning wisdom and love from the past to help us in the present.
So I love the quote here. Within those pieces, we acknowledge that we have this loss. And when we acknowledge that, we get to move to a new levels of healing. So as we acknowledge our emotions, instead of bargain, push down, get angry about it, you know, as we acknowledge that, you know, we're able to start moving to a healing process. So how do we know if what we're feeling is grief? Let's talk about the feelings associated with grief and what those feelings might look like or might feel like. So taking it back over to Minty, what are some feelings that you have experienced with loss? We've talked a lot about the feelings that we may have. You know, I'll share with you now, I talked about my parents. It was over Christmas and we were making a recipe. We would always cook together for like Thanksgiving and Christmas. And these are recipes that I have made with my mom since I was 5. So I know the recipe. And as we're doing it, she would start to change it or be like, oh, well, I never do that. I never sift the flour. And I'm like, Mom, we've sifted the flour my whole life. And I would find I was getting angry at my mom because what I was actually feeling was sadness and you know that our relationship was changing and she wasn't that mom who was teaching me anymore, if that makes sense. So I did feel anger. I see that y'all have put sadness, and this is one of those wordles where the more you use a word, the bigger it will get. So you can do more than one word, but drained, absolutely. Helpless, numb, loneliness. Yes. So all hard feelings, hard feelings to experience. So let's talk a little bit about loneliness. So one of you did it, or some of you did put loneliness. Dr. Abrams is going to share how many experience loneliness during the grieving process. And as she shares in this next segment, I want you to be aware, again, the different phases of grief that you may have experienced or you're currently experiencing now: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, or acceptance. So keeping that in mind as we listen to Dr. Abrams now.
Sometimes when we're grieving a specific significant relationship in our lives, it can be really difficult to not feel lonely. Depending on what activities we did with this person, depending on how we used to enjoy and kind of engaging in pleasure and getting to know them and exploring different things and just having different experiences with them, it can be really hard to even consider moving forward in our life without this same presence. We really miss either the conversations we used to have, or even just how we used to feel when we might be with this person. So it can really activate our grief to even think about those activities and knowing that that person won't be there. What it could be helpful to do is, again, allow yourself to have that grieving process. Allow your body to move through the motions of longing for this person, for missing those experiences that you once had with them, for thinking about the memories that you had with them, and to place honor around those memories. Cherish those moments. Right? Sometimes when we avoid some of those things, we can then also get a little bit nervous that we're going to forget some of those moments. We want to still make space for them in our bodies. That's a significance and a love that more than likely is never going to go away. But recognizing that there can sometimes be this loneliness that comes with it, and it doesn't mean that you're grieving wrong, and it doesn't mean that this loneliness is always going to be there forever, but needing the loneliness to kind of move its way through your body and allowing it to be there. Sometimes getting to know your loneliness, getting to know those parts of you that say, oh man, I really miss this person. I wish they were here. Just being able to name that out loud is really honest and a really special way for you to continue commemorating, right, the sense of loss that you experience with this person. Sometimes what we do is try to avoid some of these activities because we think it's unfair that they can't do these things anymore, that they don't get to do these things with us. But we're trying to kind of reframe and retrain that you're not doing anything unfair to them. It might be important for them, right, that you're still able to access some of these activities, and through these activities, more than likely, you're still able to tap into the love that you have for them. But honoring the fact that loneliness oftentimes is part of a grief process. It doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong or that it's bad or that you'll always feel lonely forever. But it is a point of your grief process that you'll need to allow your body to move through. And if you don't avoid it, you can actually become more centered in it and understand that this is a part of my process. I am okay, I am safe, and I still long and I miss this person, and that's okay.
So how do we allow our body to move through the process? When you feel unsafe, your survival mechanisms will take over. So you disconnect from the experience. That's also called disassociation. And that often takes over as a way to avoid experiencing pain. Okay. But as hard as this sounds, we have to allow ourselves and our body to feel that pain. Again, we can't go over, we can't go under, we can't go around. The only way we have to move through is move through. And that's by feeling the emotion. So, there will be times, like when we talk about anger and depression, there are going to be times when you need to allow yourself to feel the feeling and sit in it and be sad and be lonely. Okay. But then when we're ready, we're going to try not to push it down or block it. We're going to move through it. Being fully present, with your emotions really helps tackle the grieving process when you're having that acceptance and you can name the feeling. Again, I was acting angry with my mom, but my feeling was sadness. Right? Because of, she's not doing the recipe right. And, but I just got mad when I was really feeling sad. Okay. Stay connected to friends and family members, even when you're tempted to block everybody out. As humans, we must have that connection, even in the hardest times. But if you have experienced or are experiencing grief, it's also normal to feel helpless. So how do you get past that feeling, that helplessness? So Dr. Abrams is going to explain more.
Another experience that can come with grief that I wish was talked about a bit more is a sense of helplessness, right? That you recognize that there's so much of this grief experience that is out of your control. And then that comes with this sense that I couldn't control what happened, and now there's a sense that I can't control anything else that's going on. And I feel helpless, that I cannot recreate some of my connections with this significant person, this significant relationship that I had. And that helplessness can begin to feel really heavy. If you're noticing that with that helplessness, it's beginning to come with a number of other feelings, this frustration, this anger that I can't control for this, it can feel really hard to accept, right? And kind of engage in what we call kind of this radical acceptance, right? That this is what's happening now. And it's not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything bad. But what does it mean to actually accept that this is the present? What would it mean to engage with the world that I do have now, even though I long for this person, right? What's a way in which I can navigate the helplessness by actually controlling the things that I can control? And sometimes a way to navigate that sense of helplessness is to start doing some of those things that you might feel really angry about. And it doesn't mean kind of take on the whole exercise and kind of going full force into these things, but doing some of these things can actually allow you to feel as though you can create change. You can have different memories and kind of more even pleasant memories that you did share with this person around this specific activity. That's a way in which you continue to navigate feeling acceptance around what has happened and allowing your body to move through this fuller process of grief. What you might notice is that as you're moving through, you're going to notice some of these different waves of grief. Some moments or some days you might feel angry. Some moments or some days there might still be that denial that, no, this is not real and I've got to wake up and remember this. And some days you might notice that you have a little bit more of the bandwidth to navigate that helplessness. That's what you want to allow your body to move yourself through without pathologizing it, without penalizing it, without getting mad at yourself for feeling the intensity of these emotions. And this is also a point which can be really helpful to activate your support system. If you're also activating a social support system, it might be helpful to think about getting a therapist and someone who specializes in grief and in transition and loss to continue to help you make sense of these different waves of emotion that you might experience. And that even while you're feeling helpless, what are some things that you can do in the present to help you feel more of a sense of control and efficacy in your life?
So I love Dr. Abrams as she talks about this idea of waves of grief. I really think that's a really spot on representation of the different phases. And it really clearly does describe what people feel as people grieve the loss of someone or something. So let's go over our final overview. Let's review what was shared today. Grief can be a lifelong experience after loss, and that's okay, everyone. It's okay. There's no timeline for how long it takes, and there's not a right or wrong way to grieve. Many people discover that there is hope after loss, and in a lot of ways, grief can sometimes feel like a rebirth, a new chapter. It can be a new chapter that's honoring a loss. Okay, so as we finish up, let's hear about Dr. Wired, what he has to hear or what he has to say about grief as a redefining process.
Grief is really important. And it's like we talked about, we have loss, and then we have this thing called grief, which is our opportunity to redefine ourselves from that loss. In that process, we have also a huge opportunity in that shattered area of going through our life and having discernment and what maybe were survival skills that maybe don't serve us anymore. And maybe they were actually rather unconscious as well. So in that shattering, we actually get to go down and pick up those pieces, maybe reluctantly, I'm not saying hooray, but reluctantly, we start to rebuild the shell of ourself to hold the yoke of our authenticity. Grief allows us that process, so we get to glean from the past to be more present. So if we consciously heal from our losses, we get scars of wisdom. And then as we have our new losses, we can go back and glean from those scars to help us rather than get caught in a gaping wound and then get all mixed up in that everything, this glump. I don't have a real word for that, but I like the word glump. And so from there we start to pull out these different pieces and heal so that that wisdom can help us presently. I personally believe we also help with generational trauma. Generational, as they say, dysfunction. Because in us doing our work, our grief work, we're helping with all the historical losses that maybe weren't resolved. And we start to have this healing of unresolved losses on a collective that maybe just don't make sense, and in the midst of it, we don't care. But our job is to continue to heal us, and in healing us, we're honoring our loss when we're probably honoring stuff that we don't even know about. It allows us to release cellular memory, it allows us to live more presently, and it gives us that chance to really live presently and authentically. Once again, grief is a lifetime process. Loss can be such an enormous tragedy. It doesn't take that piece away, but I don't have to be confined and defined by that loss. Through the grief process, we have that opportunity to heal ourselves, be more present, actually relocate a relationship, to still have relationship, and heal the world.
Okay, so if you are personally grieving the loss of someone or something, please know that you're okay and it's okay. And there are brighter days in the future. And be patient, kind, gentle with yourself. Okay. And also patient, kind, and gentle with others if you're supporting someone. And just remember, the most important thing to do is listen. You know, it's scientifically proven that as humans, you know, when we can talk about our pain and someone truly listens to us, that we feel better. Just think about what if you've had a bad day at work and you can come home and vent to your best friend or your spouse, you know, you feel better. So let someone else talk. Again, just let them be there. It's not about us giving advice. It's not about us telling them how to fix it or that they need to get out or exercise or, you know, that's not for us to do. We need to be there to listen. You know, when a bone is broken, you know, no words can heal it, only time can. So we can be the cast for the broken bone of grief. You know, hold them, offer that space to heal, and then, you know, let time do the healing. We're there to support. And I think that's really beautiful. So as we come to a close today, and again, thank you for staying on with us past the hours. We had those sound issues at the beginning. I appreciate you staying on. You know, I'd like for us to support one another and let us help one another through grief. So if you've had these experiences of grief or are grieving currently, what is something that has brought peace to you in some way? Or what is something that is helping you? So I would love if there's something that's working for you, you know, or something that you want to try. How can we help each other, those of us who are on this evening? Do you have any advice? And as you're thinking about that, I would like to offer you a method for remembering some tips that can help people. It's called COPE, and it's an acronym for understanding the elements of good coping. And I'm actually going to put this in the chat box because I want you to be able to take it with you and read along with me. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. I'm going to put it in the chat box. Oh, you know what? This isn't going to let me, Tina. So I'm going to put it in the chat box for you, and then maybe you can send it on to everybody. But I am.
That works.
Okay, and it's not letting me do that, so I'll just send you an email, a quick email after this. But here's COPE. So C, if you have notes or a piece of paper, C is compassion for self. Okay, trust that there's no right or wrong way to cope with grief. You know, it's going to be different for each person. The key is to be gentle and compassionate. So that's the C, compassion for self. The O in COPE is open communication. Be open with others about your needs. Don't be afraid to say no to invitations if you're not ready for them. That's okay. You know, when invited to events or parties, phrases such as, I hope to come, but it's hard for me to make a commitment or predict what that day may be like, but I'll let you know. Thank you so much for asking. Or I don't think I'm ready yet, but please ask me again. That may help people understand what you're feeling. So compassion for self, open communication. The P in COPE is planning. Plan ahead for how to manage events, as it might be hard to predict, you know, ahead of time how you may feel on any given day. It could help to have a backup plan in case you need to leave an event early, or there may be a last minute change in plans. So decide or know what limitations might come up before. So that's planning. And then the E in COPE is engage in self-care. Engage in self-care. You know, perhaps you can manage the natural chaos, you know, with interludes of emotional and spiritual respite, whatever it takes for you. It may be reaching out to others for support. It may be going, you know, and just moving your body and going for a walk. It may be able, you know, indulging in that piece of cake or whatever it may be. But coping with grief works. And it looks like the advice y'all given: watch comedy, going for a walk, playing with my pets, and listening to positive music. Yes. Take your time. So this looks like you're supporting someone. Take your time. I'm here. Perfect. Prayer, absolutely. Music, yes. Counseling. I like that Dr. Abrams touched on that in the last video. Let your feelings flow. Don't run away from them. It's okay to not be okay. All of those are absolutely great pieces of advice and wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing with me today, spending time as we take on the difficulty of how to process grief after a loss. And if you're looking for more information on grief and other mental health topics that you may want to check out, the other courses that are in parentguidance.org. So right here, you have parentguidance.org that you can go to. And when you click on courses, which is right up here, it will take you to all different sorts of topics that may help you. Grief is one of them. Loss is one of them. Okay, so when you log in, you'll want to make sure you create a username and password, and everything is free. Okay, so it just wants to make sure that you can track the courses that you've taken, and also for site security, but it's completely free. Okay, but next, what is next for Alachua? I think I said it right. If not, Tina, I apologize. But the next is building your child's confidence, and that's going to be on February 23rd. So you don't have to pre-register. You will just scan that QR code to join. And this is a session where you can learn strategies you can use to help your children develop a confident and healthy identity. So thank you again, Dr. Edwards, Dr. Griffin, for making these resources available to parents. And I want to turn it back over to Miss Tina to say hello. And again, thank y'all for staying on with us this extra 10 minutes as we had problems at the beginning. But Tina, I will turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That your presentation and those videos really, you know, I think it really hits home because we all did experience, I think, major loss during, even with COVID, you know, and these past 2 years have been very, very tough. And so even the interaction and just learning about how to kind of cope through things, that was amazing. So thank you so much for providing that helpful information to us. And hopefully we can all take a piece of that and apply it to our everyday lives as we move forward, because grief is definitely something that is tough. It's really tough. So thank you for joining us tonight. Each week, you're available to connect with us for more informative presentations and discussions. So again, my name is Tina Folston Hayes. I am the Parent Academy Specialist for Educational Equity and Outreach for the Alachua County Public Schools. And join us next Thursday for another helpful, informative presentation from someone within our district that will be providing maybe some information about ESC. And it may be a, pardon this interruption, type of webinar, because we know that there's some important stuff coming up about our seniors and their graduations, and making sure that they have everything ready to apply to go to school, go to college next year. And so we may have a little bit of interruption in our ESC session, and we'll probably do something with the colleges and things like that. And I haven't quite secured that yet, but we will definitely have something available to you for Thursday coming. Again, thank you all for joining us. I appreciate having you. If you have any questions, again, our email address is parentacademy@gm.sbac.edu, and you can definitely reach out to me, and I can provide that information that Ms. Wiley is going to send to me if you should need it. And without further ado, I will let you all go off to your evenings. Have a great night.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. Y'all take care of yourself tonight, and we will see y'all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.